Neighbors laughed when she built an ice furnace in the canyon. Oscar Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Montana winters and buried his wife and daughter to the cold, told her, "You'll freeze solid. The coyotes will scatter what's left." She had $7, 12 miles from help, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 55 degrees in 7 hours. But 5 months earlier, Marta Koskinen had never built anything from stone in her life. She arrived in Gallatin County, Montana Territory, on the 20th of August, 1887, with $43 in her pocket and a dead husband 6 weeks in the ground. Aino Koskinen had been a miner at the Butte Copper Works. A tunnel collapse had taken him in July, crushed beneath timber that was supposed to hold. They had been married 3 years. No children survived infancy. The company paid his final wages and deducted the burial costs. What remained fit in a canvas bag she carried on her lap for the 2-day stagecoach ride from Butte to Bozeman. The claim she filed on was 160 acres at the mouth of Highlight Canyon, 12 miles south of town. Aino had staked it the previous summer before the mines called him back. He had started a cabin, 3 walls of notched pine logs standing 8 feet high, no roof, no floor, no fourth wall. He had meant to finish it. He had meant to do a lot of things. The filing fee cost $10. That left Marta $33. She stood in the half-built cabin on her first morning and counted what she had. 1 axe, dull enough that it bounced off green wood, 1 handsaw with 3 broken teeth, 1 hammer with a loose head, 50 pounds of flour in a canvas sack, 10 pounds of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth, a bag of dried beans that weighed perhaps 8 pounds, no firewood, not a single stick. She walked outside and looked south, up the canyon. The walls rose steep on both sides. Volcanic rock, layered with pine and spruce, streaked with the white lines of distant waterfalls. The creek ran fast and cold at the canyon's bottom, fed by snowmelt that never stopped, even in August. It was beautiful. It would kill her. The first settler to find her was a Norwegian rancher named Oscar Lindqvist. He rode up to the claim on the 3rd of September, leading a pack horse loaded with nothing in particular. He was 54 years old with a face carved by wind and a beard gone white at the edges. His spread bordered hers to the north, 800 acres of grazing land he had built over 11 Montana winters. The previous January, during the storms that men were already calling the die-up, he had lost his wife and daughter, Ingrid and Solveig. The blizzard had trapped them in the root cellar while Oscar was 3 miles away, trying to save cattle that couldn't be saved. By the time he dug through the drifts, they had been dead for 2 days. Frozen together, the child still in her mother's arms, he buried them when the ground thawed in April. Lindqvist sat on his horse and looked at Marta's 3 walls. He looked at the pile of scrap lumber that passed for building materials. He looked at the axe leaning against the cabin, its edge dull even from 20 feet away. Then he looked at her. "You cannot winter here," he said. Marta wiped her hands on her skirt. She had been trying to split kindling with the dull axe. Her palms were already blistered. "I have a claim," she said. "A claim is paper. Paper burns." Lindqvist's voice was flat, without emotion. "This canyon funnels wind straight off the peaks. I've seen it reach 40 below and stay there for 2 weeks. I've seen snow pile 6 feet deep in a single night." He paused. "A woman alone in that canyon will freeze solid, and when they find you in spring, the coyotes will have scattered what's left." Marta said nothing. Lindqvist waited. When she didn't respond, he gathered his reins. "There's a boarding house in Bozeman. Swedish woman runs it, Agnes Holmberg. She has room. You could work there. Save money. Try again somewhere else in spring." "I'm not leaving." Lindqvist looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held something she couldn't read. Anger, maybe, or grief, or both. "Then you'll die here," he said, "and I'll bury you next to my wife." He turned his horse and rode back down the canyon without looking back. It's worse. Marta sat on a log that night watching the light fade from the peaks and did the math. A Montana winter required firewood. How much depended on the shelter but a rough cabin with gaps in the walls, which is what she would have if she finished it all, such as needed 8 cords minimum. A cord was a stack 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. 8 cords was a wall of wood 32 feet long. A man with a sharp axe and experience could fell, buck, split, and stack a cord in 2 days. Marta had a dull axe and no experience. She might manage a cord in a week if she didn't injure herself. Maybe. There were 12 weeks until first snow. If she worked every single day, she might cut 8 cords. But she also had to finish the cabin. 4 walls, a roof, a floor, a door, chinking for the gaps, a chimney for the stove she didn't have. She couldn't do both. She couldn't do either, really, not alone, not with $33 and a dull axe and 12 weeks. Hiring help cost $2 per cord plus board. That was $16 for the firewood alone, half her money, and she would still have to feed the man she hired while he worked. Milled lumber for a roof cost $18 she didn't have. The numbers didn't work. No matter how she arranged them, the numbers didn't work. Lindqvist was right. She would freeze. She sat on that log until the stars came out, feeling the cold settle into her bones, and wondered if she should have stayed in Butte after all. On the 9th of September, Marta hiked up Hyalite Creek looking for deadfall. Deadfall was her only hope. Trees already down, already dry, already seasoned. She wouldn't have to fell them. She could buck them into rounds with the handsaw and split them with the axe and drag them back to the claim in load small enough for a woman alone to manage. She found some, not much. A storm the previous winter had knocked down a few pines, but most of the good wood had already been scavenged. She marked what she found and kept walking, following the creek deeper into the canyon. 3 miles in, she heard the waterfall. It dropped 40 feet off a cliff of black volcanic rock, the water white and furious, throwing mist into the air that caught the afternoon light. Marta had seen waterfalls in Finland, but this one was bigger than anything she remembered. The roar of it filled the canyon. She climbed the rocks beside the falls, slipping on moss, soaking her boots in the spray. When she reached the top of the lower cliff, she found a narrow ledge that ran behind the curtain of water itself. She edged along it, one hand on the rock, and emerged into a space she hadn't expected. A grotto, a cave carved into the volcanic rock behind the waterfall, where the softer stone had eroded away beneath the harder caprock above. 15 feet deep, 20 feet wide, 8 feet high at the entrance, sloping to 5 at the back. The floor was sand and gravel, dry despite the waterfall just feet away. The walls were stone, solid and cool. A crack in the ceiling, perhaps 8 inches wide, ran back toward daylight somewhere above. Marta stood in the center of the grotto and turned in a slow circle. She had seen this before, not here, in Finland, in Oulu, where she was born, where her father had been a stonemason. He had built puntojuunit, Finnish masonry stoves, for farmhouses across the north. She had watched him as a girl, sitting on a stool in the corner of some stranger's kitchen while he stacked brick and stone with hands that never seemed to tire. She knew how they worked. Burn wood hot and fast, hotter than an ordinary fireplace. Channel the smoke through a winding path of stone before it reaches the chimney. The stone absorbs the heat. For hours after the fire dies, the stone radiates warmth into the room. Her father's stoves weighed thousands of pounds. They took weeks to build and years to master. She had never built one herself. She had only watched. But this grotto was stone on 3 sides. The walls were already built. The ceiling was already there. And in winter, she knew what would happen to that waterfall. She had seen it in Finland. The falls would freeze. Not solid, water still flowed somewhere beneath the ice, but the surface would become a wall, a curtain, a barrier that blocked the wind completely. Ice transmitted light. She remembered that too. The frozen waterfalls near Oulu had glowed blue in the winter sun, and the ice caves behind them had been bright enough to read in. The thought formed slowly, like something surfacing from deep water. If she could build a heater inside this grotto, even a crude one, a firebox of stone with a channel to that crack in the ceiling, the walls would absorb heat. The frozen waterfall would seal the entrance. The ice would let in light. She wouldn't need 8 cords of firewood. She might need 2. Maybe less. She stood in the grotto for a long time, feeling the cool stone beneath her hand, listening to the roar of the falls, doing the math in her head. It was insane. She had never built a stove. She had never worked with stone. She was betting her life on childhood memories and a cave behind a waterfall, but the alternative was certain death. And this was only probably death. Marta Koskinen had never been good at accepting certainties. On the 15th of September, she walked to Bozeman for supplies. The trip took 4 hours each way. She bought 15 pounds of salt, a coil of wire for snares, 6 fish hooks, and a length of heavy twine. The salt cost 60 cents. The wire and hooks and twine cost another 40. She had $32 left. Agnes Holmberg found her on the street outside the general store. The Swedish woman was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of iron. She had known Aino Koskinen. He had boarded with her before marrying Marta, and she had sent a letter of condolence after the funeral. "Mrs. Koskinen," Agnes said, "I heard you were still on that claim." Marta shifted her purchases to her other arm. "I am." "Oscar Lindqvist came through last week. He said you've stopped working on the cabin." Marta said nothing. Agnes's eyes narrowed. "What are you building instead?" They walked to the boarding house, and over coffee that Agnes wouldn't let her pay for, Marta described it: the grotto, the frozen waterfall, the stone heater she intended to build against the back wall. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Marta finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment. "You learned stove building from watching?" Agnes said finally. "As a child?" "Yes. My father was a mason. I watched him build dozens." "Have you ever built one yourself?" "No." Agnes set down her coffee cup. "Marta, the rocks in that creek, they hold water. Heat them too fast and they explode. I have seen a man lose an eye to a river stone that burst in a campfire." She leaned forward. "You are gambling your life on something you have never done, in a place no one can reach you if it fails." "I know." "Do you? Do you understand what happens if that heater cracks? If the draft doesn't draw? If the smoke has nowhere to go?" "Then I die." "Then you suffocate in a cave behind a frozen waterfall, alone, with no one to find you until spring." Agnes's voice was hard. "At least if you freeze in a cabin, someone might see the smoke stop rising. Someone might come to check." Marta met her eyes. "If I stay in the cabin, I freeze for certain. The numbers don't work. I've done the math." "And you think this ice furnace changes the math?" "I think it might." Agnes shook her head slowly. "You are either the bravest woman I have met or the most foolish. I cannot decide which." Marta stood. "If I'm wrong, it won't matter which I was." She walked back to the canyon that afternoon and did not return to Bozeman for 6 weeks. On the 1st of October, a man named Howard Conley rode up Hyalite Creek. Marta was 3 miles from her claim in the shallows below the waterfall, selecting stones. She had spent a week learning which rocks to choose. Granite, dense, crystalline, dry to the touch, without cracks or layering. River rocks that had been tumbled smooth were dangerous, their surfaces hiding pockets of water that would turn to steam and explode. She avoided those. She looked for angular stones, newly broken from the cliffs, still rough. She was hauling a canvas sling loaded with 30 pounds of granite when Conley appeared on the opposite bank. He was a land speculator from Helena, 40 years old, well-dressed in a way that looked absurd against the wilderness. He owned a horse worth more than Marta's entire claim. Over the past 2 years, he had purchased 3 failed homesteads in Hyalite Canyon from widows and broken men, buying them cheap and reselling them to Eastern investors as improved ranch property. Marta's 160 acres sat directly between 2 parcels he already owned. "Mrs. Koskinen," he called across the water, "I heard you'd abandoned your cabin." Marta set down the sling. The stones clattered against each other. "I haven't abandoned anything." Conley picked his way across the rocks to her side of the creek. He looked at the canvas sling. He looked at the pile of stones she had already gathered on the bank. He looked up at the waterfall, at the grotto barely visible behind the white curtain of water. "I see," he said. "You're building what exactly? A wall?" "A stove." "In a cave?" He smiled. "Behind that?" "Yes." Conley's smile widened. It did not touch his eyes. "Mrs. Koskinen, I'm a reasonable man. Your husband owed $12 to the company store in Butte. I purchased that debt last month. I'm prepared to forgive it entirely if you sign your claim over to me today." He gestured toward Bozeman. "You can go back to town. Mrs. Holmberg has room at her boarding house. I've checked." Marta picked up the canvas sling and started walking toward the waterfall. "The claim is not for sale." Conley followed. "That debt comes due November 1st. If you can't pay, I can attach your property. File a lien, force a sale to recover what I'm owed." His voice was still pleasant, almost friendly. $12 isn't much, but if you don't have it." Marta stopped. She turned to face him. "Then I will pay." Conley raised an eyebrow. "With what?" "Rocks." She held his gaze until he looked away. Then she resumed walking. The stones in her sling scraped against her back with every step. Behind her, Conley called out, "November 1st, Mrs. Koskinen, 1 month." She did not answer. She climbed the wet rocks to the ledge behind the falls and disappeared into the grotto. 1 month, $12, and she had already spent most of what remained on salt and wire. The heater took 23 days to build. She started with the firebox. 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep, 18 inches high, small enough to heat quickly, large enough to burn split wood without constant tending. She dry stacked the stones first, fitting them together like puzzle pieces, then mortared the joints with river clay mixed with sand and ash. The clay was the hardest part. She dug it from the creek bank a quarter-mile downstream, where the water had deposited fine sediment over centuries. She carried it back in buckets she made from folded bark, sealed with pine pitch. Each trip took an hour. The firebox alone required 11 trips. She dried each stone for 3 days before using it. She built small fires in the grotto, tiny, careful fires, and placed stones in a ring around them. Any stone that cracked or popped, she discarded. Only the ones that stayed solid went into the heater. The channel ran from the firebox along the cave wall for 6 feet, then turned upward toward the ceiling crack. This single turn added 12 square feet of heated stone surface. More heat captured, more warmth to radiate through the night. By the 15th of October, the firebox was complete. By the 19th, the channel The heater weighed approximately 800 pounds, less than half of what her father's Pentuyuni had weighed, but the heaviest thing Marta had ever built with her own hands. On the 20th, she lit the first test fire. Within 10 minutes, smoke filled the grotto. Her eyes streamed, her lungs burned. She crawled out onto the ledge, gasping for air, and watched gray smoke pour from the gap behind the waterfall like the cave was bleeding. The draft was wrong. The channel angle was too shallow. Smoke pooled at the ceiling instead of rising through the crack. She had built it wrong. She sat on the wet rocks beside the waterfall, coughing smoke from her lungs, and felt something crack inside her chest. 3 weeks of work, every stone hauled by hand, every joint mortared with clay she had dug herself. And none of it mattered because she had gotten the angle wrong. She could rebuild it. She would have to rebuild it. But that meant tearing out half the channel and starting over. Days of work she didn't have. November 1st was 11 days away, and she still had no money to pay Conley, and the first hard snow could come any time. The waterfall roared beside her. The sun moved behind the peaks. The temperature dropped. Marta got up. She went back into the grotto, into the smoke, and started dismantling her own work. It took 36 hours. She did not sleep. She could not afford to sleep. She tore out the upper half of the channel and rebuilt it with a steeper angle, 11 degrees instead of 6, the stones stacked to create a more aggressive rise toward the ceiling crack. Her hands cracked and bled. The cuts filled with clay and sand and ash and wouldn't stop weeping. Her eyes ached from the residual smoke. Her back screamed from lifting stones she had already lifted once before. On the evening of the 21st of October, she lit the second test fire. The smoke rose. It curled up the channel, heating the stones as it passed, and disappeared through the crack in the ceiling. A thin gray wisp emerged somewhere above the grotto. She couldn't see it, but she could smell it, carried on the wind. The draft worked. She fed the fire slowly, adding sticks one at a time, watching the smoke. It never backed up, it never pooled. The channel drew clean, and the stones began to warm. An hour after the fire died, she pressed her hand against the channel wall. It was warm, not hot. She hadn't burned enough to charge the mass, but warm, warmer than the cave air, warmer than her own skin. The principle worked. She sat in the grotto that night with her back against the warming stones and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in Montana, to believe she might survive. On the 28th of October, Agnes Holmberg appeared at the mouth of Hyalite Canyon with a mule. Marta didn't hear her coming. She was in the grotto, mortaring the final joints of the heater, when a voice echoed up from the creek below. "Mrs. Koskinen, are you alive up there?" She climbed down to find Agnes leading a mule loaded with canvas-wrapped parcels. The older woman's face was red from the cold, her breath fogging in the morning air. "How did you find me?" Marta asked. "Lindqvist told me about the waterfall. Said you were building something behind it." Agnes looked up at the falls, which had begun to ice over at the edges. "I had to see for myself." She had brought 20 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of bacon, a wool blanket, thick and gray, a jar of rendered bear fat for Marta's hands, which were cracked so badly they had started to bleed through the bandages she'd made from her spare shirt. Marta looked at the supplies. She looked at Agnes. "I cannot pay you." Agnes waved a hand. "I don't recall asking for payment. Call it a loan against your spring vegetables." Her eyes moved to the waterfall. "Now show me this ice furnace of yours." They climbed up together. Agnes was not young, and the rocks were slick with ice, but she managed. Inside the grotto she stood for a long time, studying the heater, the channel, the crack in the ceiling. "Fire it," she said. Marta built a small fire in the firebox. They watched the smoke rise through the channel and disappear. Agnes touched the stones, felt the heat beginning to spread, examined the mortar joints. "My grandmother built something like this," she said finally. "In Sweden, not as large, not as complex." She turned to Marta. "The rocks are right, dense, dry, no layering." She paused. "The draft is good. You might survive." Marta had not realized how much she needed to hear those words until they were spoken. She leaned against the warm stones of the channel and felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you," she said. Agnes shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. Winter hasn't arrived." 3 days later, Marta walked to Bozeman with her wedding ring. It was a simple gold band purchased by Ano and Butte the week before they married. He'd saved 3 months' wages for it. She had worn it every day since, through the mine collapse and the funeral and the stagecoach ride and all the weeks of stone hauling since. The jeweler on Main Street examined it under a glass, weighed it, and offered $14. Marta took the money. She found Howard Conley at the hotel, eating lunch in the dining room. He looked up from his plate as she approached, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. She set $12 on the table in front of him. "The debt is paid," she said. Conley looked at the money. He looked at her hand, at the pale circle of skin where the ring had been. He picked up the coins one by one, counting. "So it is," he said. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. "I'll send you a receipt." Marta turned to leave. "Mrs. Koskinen." His voice stopped her. "Winter hasn't started yet. I'll see you in spring." She walked back to the canyon with $2 in her pocket and nothing on her hand. The wind had shifted north. It smelled like snow. On the 9th of November, the first hard freeze came. The temperature dropped to 11 degrees below zero and stayed there for 3 days. Ice spread across the creek in sheets. Snow fell, melted, fell again, and stuck. The waterfall froze, not all at once. The ice built up in layers over several days, thickening where the spray hit the rock face, extending outward in curtains and columns. By the 3rd day, the grotto entrance was covered by a wall of ice 18 inches thick at its center. Water still flowed somewhere beneath, still fell behind the frozen surface, but the opening was sealed. Inside the grotto, Marta fired the heater each morning and evening. The stones warmed. The air temperature stabilized at approximately 34 degrees, cold enough that her breath still fogged, too warm to freeze the water in her jug. But the light. The ice wall transmitted a blue-green glow that filled the grotto like nothing she had ever seen. Not sunlight, exactly. Something stranger. Something filtered through 2 feet of frozen water. Something that made the stone walls shimmer and the air itself seemed to glow. She didn't need a candle until sunset. The ice was her window. On the 15th of November, Oscar Lindqvist rode up the canyon. The snow was too deep for a horse beyond the 1st mile, so he walked the rest, his boots crunching through the crust. He found the frozen waterfall and shouted toward it, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Mrs. Koskinen, are you in there?" Marta emerged through a gap she had carved at the edge of the ice, a narrow opening just wide enough to squeeze through, that she kept packed with snow between passages. Lindqvist stared at her. She was thin, thinner than she had been in September, but she was upright. Her cheeks were wind-burned but not frostbitten. Her eyes were clear. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "How?" She showed him. She led him through the gap in the ice, into the grotto, where the blue light glowed and the stones of the heater radiated warmth from a fire she had banked that morning. He touched the channel wall. He examined the firebox. He looked at the crack in the ceiling where the smoke escaped. For a long time he said nothing. Then, "This cold is nothing." Marta waited. "January will kill you. When it drops to 40 below and stays there for 2 weeks, when the storms come so fast you can't see your hand in front of your face, your stones won't hold enough heat. Your ice will crack. You'll run out of food." "Maybe," Marta said, "or maybe I'll survive. You don't know what January's like in this canyon. I do. I've buried people who didn't." Marta met his eyes. "Then I will die here. But I won't die yet." Lindqvist looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. She couldn't tell what. "You're a stubborn woman," he said. "I'm Finnish. It's the same thing." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned and walked back out through the gap in the ice, into the snow, down the canyon toward his horse. Marta watched him go. When he was out of sight, she packed the gap with snow and returned to her fire. December was coming. And then January. She had done everything she could. Now there was nothing left but waiting. The weeks passed. December brought snow that piled 4 feet deep around the grotto entrance. The ice wall thickened to 2 feet. Marta's firewood supply dropped to 1 cord. She had gathered 2, but the heater burned slower than a fireplace, not faster. Her flour ran low. Her bacon was gone. She ate fish from the plunge pool below the falls. The turbulent water never fully froze, and trout organs she would have thrown away in better times. She boiled cattail roots dug from the creek bank, prying them from frozen mud with a stick she had sharpened into a makeshift shovel. It was enough. Barely. Her body ate itself for what she couldn't find. On the 11th of January, 1888, the temperature rose to 44 degrees above zero. Marta stepped outside the grotto and felt warmth on her face for the first time in 6 weeks. Snow dripped from the tree branches. Water ran down the ice wall in thin streams. The sun was almost hot. She tilted her head back and let it touch her skin. 700 miles to the northwest, a wall of Arctic air was screaming south across Montana territory at 60 miles per hour. She had no way of knowing. No one did. The Signal Corps had issued a forecast that morning, and it was wrong. The blizzard came anyway. The warmth lasted until mid-afternoon. Marta spent the morning outside the grotto, gathering deadfall branches that had emerged from the melting snow. Her firewood supply was down to 3/4 of a cord, enough for another month if she burned carefully, but January was only half over. February could be worse. March had killed people before. She needed every stick she could find. The work felt almost pleasant. The sun was warm on her face. Water dripped from the ice wall in thin, musical streams. She had shed her coat by 10 o'clock, working in just her wool dress and shawl. It felt like spring. It felt like survival. By 2 o'clock, she had gathered an armload of branches and started back toward the waterfall. The sky to the north had turned a strange color, yellow-gray, like a bruise spreading across the horizon. But she didn't think much of it. Montana skies did strange things. She had seen green sunsets and pink dawns and clouds that looked like mountains. A yellow sky was just another oddity. She was 50 feet from the ice wall when the wind hit. It came without warning. One moment she was walking in shirt sleeves, sweating slightly from the labor, thinking about the fish she would catch for dinner. The next, she was knocked off her feet by a blast so cold it burned her exposed skin on contact. The branches scattered. She tried to stand, and the wind slammed her back down. Snow appeared from nowhere, not falling exactly, but filling the air horizontally, a white wall that moved faster than she could think. She couldn't see the ice wall 10 feet away. She couldn't see her own hands. She couldn't breathe. The snow was in her nose, her mouth, her lungs. Every breath was ice and suffocation. The cold was so intense it didn't feel like cold anymore. It felt like fire, like her skin was being burned off, like the air itself had become a weapon. Marta crawled. She had no idea which direction she was going. The world had become a white scream, a roar of wind and ice that obliterated everything else. She moved by feel, by instinct, by the desperate animal knowledge that if she stopped moving, she would die. Her hands found rocks, snow, more rocks. She kept crawling. Her fingers touched ice. The wall. It had to be the wall. She followed it, scraping her palms on frozen edges, tearing skin she couldn't feel. The ice curved. She found the gap, the narrow opening she used as a door, the space she had carved at the edge of the frozen waterfall, and pulled herself through. She fell onto the grotto floor and lay there gasping, her lungs seared by the cold she had inhaled, her vision swimming with black spots. Behind her, the gap was already filling with snow driven horizontal by the wind. Outside, the temperature was falling at nearly a degree every 8 minutes. The first hour was chaos. Snow poured through the gap faster than Marta could process what was happening. The wind had shifted direction. For the first time since the waterfall froze, air was being forced into the grotto instead of out. The pressure difference reversed the draft in her heater. Smoke that should have risen through the ceiling crack poured back into the cave instead. Within minutes, the grotto filled with gray haze. Her eyes streamed, her throat closed. She dropped to her hands and knees, trying to find breathable air near the floor, but the smoke was everywhere. She couldn't see the heater. She couldn't see the walls. She couldn't see anything except gray. She had to seal the gap. If she didn't seal the gap, the wind would keep forcing air in, the draft would stay reversed, and she would suffocate in her own shelter. Marta stumbled toward the entrance, blind in the smoke, guided only by the sound of the wind screaming through the opening. She found the gap by feel, a 6-inch wide channel of absolute cold cutting through the haze. She started packing snow into it. The wind fought her. Every handful she pushed in, the gusts scattered. She tried again, scattered again. Her fingers were going numb. Her lungs burned. She couldn't stop coughing long enough to take a full breath. She found chunks of ice that had broken loose from the wall's edge and jammed them into the gap. Better. The ice held where the snow wouldn't. She packed more ice, then snow behind it, then more ice. Layer by layer, handful by handful, while the smoke thickened and her vision narrowed. 40 minutes. It took 40 minutes to seal the gap. By the end, she was working by touch alone, her eyes swollen nearly shut, her throat raw, her chest heaving with coughs that produced nothing but pain. When the last handful of snow went in and stayed in, the wind stopped screaming. The pressure equalized. The smoke began to clear, slowly, painfully slowly, seeping toward the ceiling crack as the draft reestablished itself. Marta collapsed onto the grotto floor and lay there, coughing, gasping, waiting for her lungs to stop burning. The gap was sealed, but the fire had died while she fought the wind. The embers were gray and cold, and already she could feel the temperature dropping. She rebuilt the fire with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the kindling. The first match broke. The second wouldn't strike. The third caught, and she held it to the birch bark until the flame spread, then added twigs, then larger sticks, then a split log she had been saving. The fire grew. Smoke rose through the channel, heating the stones as it passed, disappearing through the ceiling crack. The draft was working again. The system was working. Marta wrapped herself in the wool blanket Agnes had given her and pressed her back against the channel wall. The stones were cold now. The hours of chaos had cost her all the stored heat from the morning's fire, but she could feel them beginning to warm again as the new fire burned. She fed it carefully. Not too much. She couldn't afford to burn through her remaining wood in one night, but enough to charge the stones with heat. The firebox glowed orange in the darkness, the grotto filled with flickering light. Outside, the blizzard screamed. The sound was unlike anything she had heard before. Not wind. Wind was something you could understand, something that rose and fell, something with rhythm. This was constant, relentless, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ice wall vibrated with it. The grotto floor trembled. The temperature inside stabilized around 32 degrees. Freezing, but survivable. She could see her breath fogging in the firelight. Frost formed on the walls farthest from the heater, but where she sat, with the heated stones at her back and the blanket wrapped tight, she was warm enough. She fed the fire another stick, then another. The stones held the heat. The smoke rose clean. The system worked. She had no way to know what was happening outside. No way to know that the temperature had already dropped to 11 below zero and was still falling. No way to know that by morning it would reach 47 below Wasser, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in under 2 minutes. No way to know that across the northern plains, from Montana to Minnesota, people were dying by the dozens. She knew only that the wind screamed, the ice held, and the stones were warm. She stayed like that for hours, feeding the fire, listening to the roar, pressing her body against the heated channel wall. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion took her. She slept with one hand on the woodpile, ready to feed the fire if it burned low. The crack woke her. It was a sound like a rifle shot, sharp, violent, echoing off the grotto walls. Marta jerked upright, her heart slamming against her ribs, her hand already reaching for the axe she kept beside her. Another crack, and another. The ice wall was breaking. She could see it now, in the dim glow of the embers. Fracture lines spreading across the frozen surface, black veins against the blue-white ice. The wall was contracting in the cold, the ice shrinking, splitting where the stress was greatest. A gap had opened at the edge of the wall, near the ceiling, perhaps 6 inches wide, perhaps more. Air screamed through it. The temperature inside the grotto plunged. Marta watched frost form on the stones, not gradually, but visibly, spreading like white mold across the rock. Her water jug froze solid. The moisture on her blanket crystallized into tiny ice crystals that glittered in the firelight. Her breath stopped fogging. It was too cold to fog. The moisture froze before it could form clouds. Outside, the temperature had reached 50 degrees below zero. Marta didn't know the number. She didn't need to. She could feel it. The cold so intense it was no longer cold, just pain. The air itself transformed into something that burned and cut and killed. She had to seal the gap or die. But sealing it meant leaving the warmth of the heater, meant crossing 8 feet of grotto floor to reach the ice wall, meant exposing her hands and face to air that would freeze flesh in under 2 minutes. She did the math in her head. 8 feet. Call it 10 steps. 20 seconds if she moved fast. Another 30 to pack ice into the gap. Another 20 to get back. 70 seconds total. At 50 below, with wind, she could lose her fingers in 90. She wrapped her hands in rags torn from her spare shirt. She wrapped her face in her shawl, leaving only a slit for her eyes. She tucked the loose ends of her dress into her belt so nothing would catch or trail. She took 3 deep breaths of relatively warm air. Held the last one. Then she moved. The cold hit her like a fist. She couldn't feel her fingers by the time she reached the ice wall. 10 steps, maybe 15 seconds. The gap was above her head, near the ceiling, a black slash through which the wind screamed like a living thing. She reached up, grabbed loose snow from the floor, packed it into the crack. It wasn't enough. The wind tore through what she had packed, scattering it back into her face. She needed ice, solid ice. She found chunks that had broken loose from the wall's edge. Her fingers were clumsy, barely working, but she managed to grip them and jam them into the gap one after another, pressing them in place with hands she could no longer feel. 20 seconds. 30. The gap narrowed. Air still whistled through, but weaker now. 40 seconds. Her hands stopped working. She couldn't grip the ice anymore. Her fingers wouldn't close, wouldn't obey, had become dead things attached to her wrists. 50 seconds. She punched the final chunk of ice into place with her palm, felt it stick, felt the wind drop to a whisper. She stumbled back to the heater. The warmth of it felt like fire against her frozen skin. She held her hands over the embers, inches from the coals, watching the color change, white to gray, to purple to red as the blood returned. For a long moment she felt nothing. Then the feeling came back. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced, beyond chilblains, beyond frostbite, beyond the ache of cold hands warming too fast. This was like her fingers were being crushed and burned at the same time, like someone was driving nails through her knuckles, like the bones themselves were shattering from the inside. She didn't scream. She couldn't scream. She could only rock back and forth, her hands hovering over the coals, tears streaming down her face and freezing on her cheeks. But the gap was sealed, mostly sealed. Air still seeped through, a thin whistle instead of a scream. She fed the fire another stick. The stones began to warm again. Outside, the blizzard raged on. The second day was worse. Not because the storm intensified. It couldn't intensify. It was already as bad as weather could be. But because Marta now understood what she was facing. The first night had been chaos, reaction, pure survival instinct. The second day was knowledge. She knew the temperature was still dropping. She knew the ice could crack again. She knew that every piece of wood she burned brought her closer to having nothing left to burn. Her thermometer, Ino's thermometer, the one he had bought in Butte to hang outside their never-finished cabin, read 47 degrees below zero at dawn on January 13th. She had brought it inside the grotto months ago, hung it near the entrance where she could check it each morning, 47 below. She had never seen a number like that. She had never imagined a number like that. The ice wall groaned and shifted, settling into its new shape, but the cracks she had sealed held. The gap stayed closed. She checked it every hour, pressing her hand against the packed ice and snow, feeling for any movement of air. Inside the grotto, the stone walls radiated heat from the previous night's fires. Marta burned small, careful fires, enough to recharge the mass, not enough to waste fuel. The air temperature hovered at 31 degrees, 1 degree below freezing. Her breath fogged. Water in the jug stayed solid. But she was alive. She counted her firewood, stacked it, measured it against the wall. Half a cord remained. At the rate she was burning 3 fires a day, each burning perhaps 8 pounds of wood, she had 3 weeks of fuel, maybe less if the cold continued, maybe more if it warmed. If another blizzard came before spring, she would burn through everything and freeze. She couldn't think about that. She could only think about the next fire, the next hour, the next minute. She ate the last of her dried fish. She drank snowmelt heated over the fire. She wrapped herself in the blanket and pressed her back against the warm stones and waited. The wind screamed. The ice held. The stones radiated heat. She survived the second day. The third day, she almost broke. It was the silence that did it. The blizzard died sometime before dawn, ended as abruptly as it had begun, the wind dropping from a roar to a whisper to nothing in the space of an hour. When Marta woke, The grotto was quiet. No screaming wind, no groaning ice. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing against her ears. She lay still for a long time, afraid to move, afraid that moving would prove the silence was a hallucination, a trick of her exhausted mind. Then she heard a bird, a single note, high and clear, somewhere outside the ice wall. A chickadee, maybe, or a nuthatch. Something small and ordinary and alive. Marta started crying. She couldn't stop. 3 days of terror and exhaustion and cold poured out of her in great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried until her chest ached and her eyes were swollen, and she couldn't breathe through her nose anymore. She cried for Aino, who would never see this place, who would never know if his claim had become a home. She cried for the ring she had sold, the gold band he had saved 3 months' wages to buy. She cried for the months of work and fear and loneliness, the endless days of hauling stones and mixing mortar, and wondering if she was building her own tomb. She cried because she was alive when she should have been dead, and because she hadn't truly believed she would make it until this moment, and because the silence was so beautiful after 72 hours of screaming wind. After a while, she didn't know how long, the crying stopped. She wiped her face with her hands. Her hands came away wet with tears that had already started to freeze. She had survived. Now she needed to see what was left. She dug her way out through the packed snow at the entrance. It took almost an hour. The snow had drifted against the ice wall during the storm, packed hard by the wind. She had no shovel, just her hands and a flat stone she used as a scraper. By the time she broke through to open air, her arms were shaking with exhaustion. She emerged into a world transformed. The snow was 6 feet deep. She couldn't see the ground anywhere, just white, unbroken white, stretching down the canyon and up toward the peaks. The trees were buried to their lower branches. Rock formations she had used as landmarks had vanished entirely. The sun blazed in a sky of impossible blue, reflecting off the white until it hurt to look. The air was so clear she could see individual peaks 50 miles away. The temperature was 42 degrees below zero. Still deadly. But the wind was gone. Marta stood outside the grotto, her breath freezing into crystals that hung in the air like tiny stars, and looked at her thermometer. She looked at the ice wall, scarred with fracture lines, but intact. The cracks she had sealed were visible now, dark seams against the blue-white surface, but they had held. She looked at the smoke rising from the crack in the ceiling, thin and gray against the blue sky. A sign of life. A signal to anyone watching that someone was still breathing inside that frozen cave. She had survived 72 hours, 55 degrees of temperature drop in the first 7 hours, 91 degrees total from the false spring warmth to the deepest cold, 3 nights in a cave behind a frozen waterfall with nothing but 800 pounds of heated stone between her and death. Marta Koskinen sat down in the snow and let the sun touch her face. She was alive. The news came slowly to the canyon. Over the following days, as the temperature rose and the roads became passable, word filtered down from Bozeman. Travelers stopped at the canyon mouth. A supply wagon made it through on the 18th. Oskar Lindqvist sent a rider ahead of himself on the 15th. The blizzard had struck the entire northern plains from Montana to Minnesota. They were calling it the Children's Blizzard, or the Schoolhouse Blizzard, because of who had died. The storm had hit in mid-afternoon when children were in school. Some teachers had dismissed their students early, fooled by the morning warmth. Others had tried to lead them home when the storm hit. Many never made it. In Bozeman, 3 people had died. The first was a man named John Halverson, frozen walking to his barn. The distance was 90 feet. His body was found the next morning, face down in the snow, 30 feet short of the barn door. The second was a woman named Clara Bergstrom, who went out for firewood and couldn't find her way back. The woodpile was 20 feet from her cabin door. She died 12 feet away, disoriented by the whiteout, turned around in the snow. The third was a child named Peter Solverson, 8 years old. His school teacher had tried to keep the students inside when the storm hit, but Peter's father had come for him, certain he could make it home. Their farm was only half a mile away. The father survived by crawling into a haystack. Peter made it to within 60 feet of their barn. They found him the next morning. One hand was still reaching toward the barn door. Marta heard these stories, and others, more and worse, and felt something she couldn't name. Not relief, exactly. Not survivor's guilt. Something heavier. Something that sat in her chest like a stone. She had survived because she had gambled everything on a cave behind a waterfall and childhood memories of her father's work. If she had been wrong, if the stones hadn't held, if the ice had shattered, if the draft had failed, she would have been one more frozen body waiting for spring. But she hadn't been wrong. The stones had held. The ice had survived. The draft had worked. She had survived because she had been lucky enough to be right. Across Montana Territory, at least 40 people were dead. Across the northern plains, 235 confirmed, with estimates running to 1,000. Most were children. Marta added wood to her fire. She watched the smoke rise through the channel, through the ceiling crack, into the cold blue sky. She was alive, and she would not waste it. Morsikan. On the 16th of January, 4 days after the blizzard, Oscar Lindqvist appeared at the canyon mouth. The snow was too deep for his horse, so he had snowshoed the last mile and a half. He was carrying a pack loaded with dried meat and flour and coffee, supplies for someone he expected to find dead. Marta met him outside the grotto, fishing in the plunge pool below the falls. The turbulent water had stayed open through the blizzard. Something about the constant motion, the aeration, the way falling water resisted ice. She had been catching trout all winter from this pool. The fish were hungry after the storm. Lindqvist stopped 20 feet away and stared at her. She looked terrible. She knew she looked terrible. She had lost perhaps 15 pounds since September. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders. Her cheekbones jutted sharp beneath her skin. Her hands were wrapped in rags, still healing from the frostbite she'd suffered sealing the ice gap. Her hair hadn't been properly washed in weeks, but she was standing. She was breathing. She was holding a fishing line and watching it with the patient concentration of someone who had survived. "You're alive," Lindqvist said. Marta pulled a trout from the water. "Yes." "How?" She set the fish on a flat rock and began threading another worm onto her hook. "I built what I needed." "Show me." They climbed up to the grotto together, Lindqvist moving slowly on the icy rocks. His snowshoes weren't made for climbing. Twice he slipped and caught himself. Marta didn't offer to help. He wouldn't have accepted it. Inside, the blue light glowed through the ice wall, dimmer now, filtered through snow packed against the exterior, but still present, still beautiful, still strange. Lindqvist stood in the center of the grotto and turned in a slow circle. He looked at the heater against the back wall. He looked at the channel running along the stone. He looked at the crack in the ceiling where smoke curled lazily upward. He walked to the heater and pressed his palm against the channel stones. They were warm, not hot, but warm, hours after the morning fire had burned down to ash. He left his hand there for a long moment. "This is what you were building," he said, "when I told you to leave." "Yes." "When I told you that you would freeze." "Yes." He pulled his hand back. His eyes were wet. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was rough, barely controlled. "I said you would freeze solid. I said the coyotes would scatter what was left of you in spring. He paused, and his voice cracked. I was wrong. Marta set down the fish she had carried up from the pool. You were trying to protect me. No. Lindqvist shook his head. I was protecting myself from watching another woman die in this canyon, from finding another frozen body when the snow melted. He looked at the ice wall, at the blue light filtering through the cracks and seams. My wife, Ingrid, she died because I wasn't there, because I was 3 miles away trying to save cattle that couldn't be saved, because I chose animals over my family, and the storm took what I loved while I was digging out livestock. Marta waited. I have carried that with me every day since. Every morning I wake up and remember finding them, Ingrid with her arms around Solveig, both of them frozen. My daughter's face. His voice broke. He stopped. After a long moment, he continued. When I saw you, a woman alone, underprepared, determined to stay, I saw her. I saw Ingrid. I saw her dying again because I wasn't there to help her. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I told you to leave because I couldn't bear to watch it happen twice. But I didn't die. No. He looked at her, and something had shifted in his face. Grief was still there, but something else too. Respect, maybe, or wonder. You didn't die. You built this ice furnace out of rocks and clay and memory, and you survived the worst storm I have seen in 11 winters. He walked around the heater again, touching the stones, examining the joints, studying how the channel rose toward the ceiling crack. His rancher's hands, calloused, practical, used to building things, traced the construction with professional appreciation. Can you teach it? He asked. Yes. There's a family, the Ericksons. Their cabin burned 2 weeks before the blizzard. A chimney fire that spread to the roof. They've been living in a canvas tent with blankets nailed over the openings. Marta felt her stomach tighten. They survived? In a tent? Barely. The youngest, a girl, 4 years old, has frostbite on both feet. They're in Bozeman now. The doctor isn't sure she'll keep her toes. Lindqvist's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned to deliver hard news without breaking. The father wants to rebuild. He has one room of the old cabin still standing, stone foundation, partial walls. But he lost his stove in the fire. He has no way to heat it. Marta set down the fish. Where is the cabin? 8 miles north of here, on Bridger Creek. I can be there tomorrow. Lindqvist nodded slowly. He turned toward the gap in the ice, the narrow passage that led back out into the cold. Then he stopped. Thank you, he said without turning around. For what? For surviving. For not making me bury another woman in this canyon. He climbed out through the gap and disappeared into the snow. By February, Marta had helped 4 families, the Ericksons first. Their cabin was half destroyed. Fire had taken the roof and one wall, leaving a single room standing amid charred timber and collapsed stone. The father, a Norwegian named Bjorn, had covered the open side with canvas and spent the blizzard huddled with his wife and 3 children around a fire pit in the center of the room. His daughter Astrid, the 4-year-old, had lost 2 toes. She would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Marta built a heater in the corner of the surviving room. It was smaller than her own, no channel, just a mass of dried stone stacked against the intact wall. But the principle was the same. Heat the stones with a hot, fast fire. Let the stones radiate warmth for hours after the fire dies. She showed Bjorn how to select granite that wouldn't explode, how to test stones by heating them slowly near a small fire first, how to mortar the joints with clay and ash, how to bank the coals at night so the heat would last until morning. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient. The Ericsson's heater would never perform as well as a true Finnish pontiuni, would never hold heat for 16 hours on a single firing, but it held heat better than a fireplace. The family burned 2 cords of wood that winter instead of the 6 they would have needed. Astrid slept beside the warm stones every night, her damaged feet wrapped in wool, the heat seeping into her bones. The Halversons were next. A young couple with an infant, living in a dugout carved into a hillside south of town. Marta showed them how to stack stones against the back wall, how to create a small firebox that would heat the earthen walls around it. The dugout became a womb of warmth, dark, cramped, but survivable. Then the Petersons. Then the Morrisons. Each home was different. Each heater was improvised, adapted, made from whatever materials were available. None of them were beautiful. All of them worked. She never charged. When families offered to pay, in eggs, in flour, in coins scraped together from nothing, she refused. When they asked why, she told them what her father had told her. Knowledge kept is a knowledge wasted. By March, word had spread beyond Gallatin County. A land surveyor named Thomas Breck visited her claim and asked to see the grotto. He spent 3 hours inside, sketching the heater, measuring the channel, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. He wrote a description of what he called the Koskinen stove in a letter to his brother in Minnesota. The brother worked for a farming journal. The letter was published that spring. Marta never saw it. But over the following years, homesteaders from the Dakotas to Nebraska would build crude versions from that description alone. Stone heaters in sod houses, thermal mass systems in dugouts, improvised pontonit made from whatever the land provided. Her father's knowledge, passed to her through watching, passed to strangers through words on paper, spreading, surviving. Agnes Holmberg came to the canyon when the roads cleared in late March. She brought a wagon loaded with seeds for spring planting, carrots, potatoes, turnips, beans, and she stayed 3 days. They sat in the grotto together on the first evening, watching the ice wall drip as it began to thin in the warming air. "I told you the rocks might explode," Agnes said. Marta smiled. "I chose the right rocks. I told you that you had never built one, that you'd learned by watching as a child. I watched my father. That was enough." Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Meltwater dripped from the ice wall, pooling on the grotto floor before trickling toward the entrance. "I was wrong to doubt you," she said finally. "I should have helped more. I should have come up here myself instead of staying safe in my boarding house." Marta shook her head. "You brought flour when I had none. You brought a blanket when I had only rags." She held up her hands, the skin still rough and scarred, but healed. "You brought bear fat. That fat saved my hands from cracking open completely. Without it, I couldn't have worked the stones, couldn't have sealed the ice when it cracked." She paused. "You helped when it mattered." Agnes looked at her hands. Then she looked at her face. Then she laughed. A sudden, surprised sound, the first time Marta had heard her laugh since Aino's funeral. "You are a remarkable woman, Marta Koskinen." "I am a Finnish woman. We don't die easily." "No." Agnes stood and stretched, her bones creaking. "I suppose you don't." Howard Conley never returned to the canyon. In April, Marta received a letter from his office in Helena. The letterhead was expensive, embossed with gold. The handwriting was a clerk's careful script, precise and impersonal. Mr. Conley was divesting his Hyalite Canyon holdings, the letter explained. A cattle company from Minneapolis had made an offer. The transaction would close by month's end. At the bottom of the letter, in a different hand, hurried, angular, clearly Conley's own, was a postscript. I'll offer you $400 for your claim. Final offer. Reply by May 1st. $400. 25 times what she had left after the filing fee. Enough to return to Bozeman and live comfortably for a year. Enough to start over somewhere warmer, somewhere easier, somewhere that didn't require survival by stubbornness. Marta read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, carried it to the hearth of her newly finished stove, and placed it in the flames. The claim was not for sale. She finished the cabin in May. It took 6 weeks, working alone. Using lumber she milled herself from trees felled with the axe Lindqvist had sharpened for her in February. The old Norwegian had ridden up one morning with the axe across his saddle and a whetstone in his pack. He had spent an hour working the blade while Marta cooked breakfast, saying nothing, and when he left, the edge was sharp enough to shave with. 4 walls rose from the foundation Aino had started. A roof of hand-split shakes kept out the rain. A floor of packed earth gave way to plain boards by summer's end. A door that latched, with hinges, Marta forged herself from scrap iron, and in the corner a proper stove, not a crude survival heater. A true pontojuni, the kind her father had built in Finland, the kind she had watched him construct a dozen times as a girl. A firebox lined with the best fire brick she could find. A baking chamber above it where bread could rise. A channel that wound through 3,000 pounds of stone before reaching the chimney. It took her the entire summer. When it was finished, it could hold heat for 16 hours on a single firing. The cabin stayed warm through blizzards on a fraction of the wood a fireplace would need. She never spent another winter in the grotto. But she visited it sometimes when the waterfall froze and the ice wall glowed blue-green in the winter sun. She would sit inside with her back against the stones that had saved her life, watching the light filter through the ice, remembering what it felt like to survive the unsurvivable. The heater she had built there still stood. The mortar cracked eventually. River clay wasn't meant for decades of use, but the stones remained stacked against the back wall of the cave like a monument. No one else ever lived behind the frozen waterfall. But for 3 months in the winter of 1887 to 88, it had been home. Marta Koskinen proved up her homestead claim in 1892, 5 years of continuous residence as the law required. The land office clerk in Bozeman noted in his ledger that she was one of 14 single women to prove up that year in Gallatin County, and one of only 3 who had done it entirely alone, without family, without hired help, without a husband to share the work. She never remarried. Offers came, she was not unattractive, and a woman who could build a cabin with her own hands was valuable on the frontier, but she turned them all down. She had loved Aino. She didn't need to love again. She raised cattle on her 160 acres, starting with 3 heifers Lindqvist sold her at cost in the spring of '89. By 1900, she had expanded to 400 acres, purchasing the Lindqvist ranch when Oscar died of pneumonia that winter. The old Norwegian had never quite forgiven himself for predicting her death. Every time they spoke, she could see it in his eyes, the memory of what he had said to her that September day. But they had become something like friends in the years since. Not close, exactly, but something. When he knew he was dying, he sent word that he wanted her to have first refusal on the land. She paid fair market price. She wouldn't accept a gift. Marta was known throughout the Gallatin Valley as a woman who could build anything, fix anything, and who would help anyone who asked without expectation of payment. She taught the stone heater design to dozens of families over the decades. She never kept count. The knowledge spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever soil was ready. She died in 1923, aged 67, in the cabin she had finally completed in the spring of 1888. She went quietly, in her sleep, On a January night when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero and the wind screamed down the canyon just as it had 35 years before. The stove she had built kept the cabin warm until morning. She's buried beside Ino in the Bozeman Cemetery. Under a headstone she carved herself before her hands grew too stiff to hold the chisel. The inscription is simple. Marta Koskinen, 1856 to 1923. She built what she needed. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 55 degrees in 7 hours. Oscar Lindqvist, who had survived 11 Montana winters and buried his wife and daughter to the cold, told a Finnish widow that a woman alone in that canyon would freeze solid, and when they found her in spring, the coyotes would have scattered what remained. Marta Koskinen did not freeze. She sat in a grotto behind a wall of ice, her back against stones that held the heat of a fire 8 hours dead, watching blue light filter through the frozen falls while the worst blizzard in territorial history screamed outside. She had $7 and no neighbor within 12 miles. She had never built anything from stone in her life. She learned by watching, built by necessity, and survived by stubbornness. The coyotes found nothing to scatter. The ice held. The stones remembered the fire. In the blue glow of that frozen morning, Marta Koskinen was alive.